Hello, my fellow kid. Welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. It's been a long time since we've had one of these, and unfortunately, that's because Votann haven't been getting too many placings. So I was absolutely thrilled when I woke up this morning, or yesterday morning rather, when this was recorded, and saw on Meta Monday that the Leagues of Votann had not one, but two top 20 placings. One of them was top 6, which I think is absolutely amazing to see at one of the largest events this year, the Nottingham Super Major. So to celebrate finally having another competitive list to look at today, let's take a look at both lists that were played at this event and discuss their placings. As always, we'll take a look at the Votann placings themselves in terms of the matchups, the scores, how they ranked. We'll take a deep dive list analysis, discuss some strengths and weaknesses, and try to contextualize the results of the placings by looking at some of the matchups. But before we go any further, of course, I want to thank these amazing channel members for helping to support the channel and making me bring you guys new content each week. Jordan Stuckenschneider, The Pulp, Fusel, Sam P, Austri TM, Dabadakis, Travis Taylor, Aaron Easley, Smoking Miniatures, Mr. Wolf, Koramar, and Chaos King Plays. Thank you guys so much. It really does mean a lot. Now, the first list we're going to look at was piloted by Alex Jins, who came 6th out of 396 players at the event, taking home a 5-win, 0-draw, 0-loss score. Matchups included Votann at 100 versus Custodes at 29, Votann at 90 versus Tau at 86, Votann 96 versus Custodes at 65, Votann 86 versus Dark Angels at 42, and Votann 96 versus Custodes again for a third matchup at 58. So really did well into Custodes here. There are a couple reasons for that, as we'll see in just a moment, but overall, pretty decent matchups. One of these standout games to me, in my opinion, here is Votann at 90 versus Tau at 86. Tau is, in my experience, a sort of difficult game to play because they're both kind of playing the same game, both armies, of course, and Tau kind of plays it a little bit better. So to see Votann come out ahead and with two really high scores is quite nice, but of course 90-86 would effectively be a WTC draw. So very tight game overall, and it's nice to see Votann manage to pull ahead slightly and secure the win. All right, now in terms of the list itself, we have some really interesting pieces here that are worth talking about. So let's kick things off first with the characters. We have a Brokier Iron Master running Grim Demeanor as an enhancement, an Iron Champion running Appraising Glare. These two enhancements are the best enhancements out of the bunch, of course. Appraising Glare specifically being basically mandatory if you want to run a competitive list because it just helps give you some of that token generation. Now, taking an Iron Master here, spoiler alert as we look through the list, we are attaching it to a 6-man Brokier Thunderkins squad. And I think at this point, if you're investing inside of a 6-man unit, you're investing inside of a character to accompany them, to increase their ballistic skill, to provide a little bit more of a defensive profile and to overwatch threats, I think you do take the extra cost, the extra 20-25 points. I haven't run Grim Demeanor in such a long time, but I do think you pay that price and you take the enhancement. This just guarantees that no matter what you're shooting at, you will always get the full benefit of your damage that goes through. You will ignore modifiers, you will ignore anything that impacts the characteristic. So this does affect the damage, it does affect the AP, and you just effectively make sure that you are getting the most amount of efficiency possible out of this unit. And you should, because you're paying a premium for it. You're paying quite a lot of points to have this package, so you might as well make sure that it's going to be able to actually connect with its target. So Grim Demeanor here, a solid choice in this context. Moving along, we have the heart of the list. In terms of its trading pieces and its resources, we have 10 Hearthkin Warriors. These guys are running the standard high-las rifle and high-las rotary cannon. Nothing too special here. They stick you to backfield. You can use them to trade early in the game, move block, things like that. A good utility piece to have. I personally like running 2 squads of 10. This list is only running 1 squad of 10, and we'll see why as we look at the next unit in the list, which are 3x5 Chthonian Berserks. So the Berserks are effectively glorified warriors. They're the same price as a full squad of 10, so you're only getting half the amount of models, but they're significantly stronger and significantly more effective at trading. You bring these guys onto an objective, you're hitting things on 3s, you're wounding them on 2s, usually. They trade quite well, and I think especially in a Custodes matchup, being able to just clean pickup, those Custodian Guard infantry models, because you're damage 3 flat, is massive. It's the perfect profile in a lot of ways because you have mass volume of attacks, you are hitting on 3s, you are wounding them on 2s, you're forcing their invulnerable saves because you're AP2, and just generally you're drowning them in these attacks that each one that is failed will kill a model. So this is a really strong piece to have, and it looks like having 3 of them has proven to be quite effective. I think I also want to skip a little bit ahead here and talk about the Thunderkin. Now, a lot of people have been saying that this is a vehicle meta, and I think this is reflected in the list as well, because what we see here is some tech that is heavily put towards dealing with anti-tanks, dealing with tanks, dealing with vehicles, right? We've incorporated a lot of aspects of that. So like the 6 Thunderkin squad and a 3-man Thunderkin squad as well. We're getting a little bit ahead here, skipping over to Sagittars, but really what I want to point out here is that we're teching into this. We're specifically bringing these units that are probably not that great in other contexts to this event because we're anticipating running into a lot of vehicles. And it does seem to have worked. So right now, inside of that Custodes matchup, we could deal with any dreadnoughts that are brought to the table. We could deal with any infantry that's at the table as well. I'm not saying this is specifically designed to fight Custodes, but it does play really well into them. In a similar vein, we're running 4 Sagittars. Now, 4 Sagittars is a pretty nice amount to have. Each one could transport the Berserk squad, and then one is also going to take one of your 5-man Hearthkin warriors that are split up. Now, a very interesting configuration here. We have 2 that are running a Hylas and 2 that are running an L7 missile launcher. And I think this is also kind of leveraging some of Votann's damage capabilities for that anti-tank tech in such a way that we're building synergy within the list. We have a lot of variability in the amount of damage we could put through with the Brokier Thunderkin out of D6 shots each. And we have our Sagittars, of course, with the Casino Gun on the Hylas. So I think having something that's a little bit more stable, a little bit more predictable and reliable, and the benefit of having longer range, of course, I think really complements the overall design of the list as a whole. We now have a way of synergistically determining, okay, I've shot this and that into this target. I really need to get like 3-4 damage through. I will put this vehicle into it now because I know if the damage connects, it will pick up the model. So I do see the benefit to this, the merit, and I think in this design specifically, it works quite well. Moving along, we have 5 Ioneer Hearthguard. So a little light on Hearthguard here, but that's no problem at all. We're running a standard loadout of Vulcanites and the Concussion Gauntlets. The Hessiers, of course, running a Hammer, and they are taking a Teleport Crest. This makes the unit a lot more flexible. Obviously, it will be accompanied by an Ioneer champion, and you could put this in Deep Strike to start the game off with, or you could put it inside of the next unit, which is a Hecaton Land Fortress. So already we have some redundancies here building into that synergy within the list. It's very flexible if you notice, right? You could have these Thunderkins start in reserves, you can start them on the table, but 99% of the time you're probably going to start them in reserves. You can start 3-man inside of the Hecaton Land Fortress, or you could sub that out and substitute it for an Ioneer Hearthguard brick inside of a Land Fortress instead, if you're playing against something like Catan's, for example, where you want to have that delete button available. You can have a Deep Strike threat with the Hearthguard, or you could start them inside of a Land Fort. You can start the Thunderkin in reserves or start the Thunderkin in the Land Fortress. They still get the benefit of rerolling wounds once they come out. So you do have this really nice threat that just has a little bit more reliability because of these multipliers and because of these buffs that you're applying to the units. And on that note, of course, we do have the Hecaton Land Fortress, which is just a solid body overall. It's T12, it has 16 wounds. It's pretty durable with access to Armor of Contempt. Yes, Armor of Contempt got a little bit nerfed, but I do think this is overall to our advantage in a lot of situations because now we don't have to worry about our whole army bouncing off of something that ignores 1 point of AP and potentially has cover. Now, only one unit or model is going to be affected by that, and the rest of our units are able to get the full benefit of their AP. So I do think overall it's a slight buff for us, despite it impacting our Land Fortresses a little bit more negatively. But again, just a solid piece to have. It's durable, it transports either your Thunderkin or your Hearthguard, and it's a bit of a force multiplier because you get that added benefit of rerolling your wound rolls. The last thing we have are 3x3 Pioneers, just a solid utility piece. You screen well with them, you could push up with them to force screens back, and of course you go up and down to score some secondaries or threaten flanks or backfield objectives. To wrap the list up, we have a squad of 10 Jaegers. This is probably a little bit more mandatory in this context because we are running 4 Sagittars, we are running 3x3 bikes, so we will be making use of scout moves, and we want to make sure that we can solidify those early scout moves in the game without having to worry about our opponent blocking them. It also means you could try to secure your expansion objective a little bit more risk-free because you already have something on it. You could use it to try to move block and like secure tempo in the game. So a really solid piece to have. And in this archetype specifically, really beneficial to the core of the list. All right, so what are some of the strengths of this list? Now, like I said, it has amazing anti-tank tech. So I think this was designed with the idea that they're going to be playing against a lot of tanks, a lot of high toughness targets. Having the Thunderkin here that wound them on 2s, having the Sagittars that are all teched into having, well, naturally they all have the anti-tank gun, but having some that have more of a reliable and consistent output into tanks, I think is a really clear indicator that this player was anticipating running into a tank meta. And of course, they designed their list based around that. The list also has some really great trading potential, making use of its berserks, a really solid infantry piece that it has melee capabilities. You throw that onto an objective, it always punches up, and especially if you're playing into something like elite units, or even tanks in a lot of cases, you could increase your AP by 2 potentially if the target's double judged, and that just really amplifies your output, pushing most vehicles to either a 6-up, 5-up, or potentially no save at all. Another strength of the list is that it's quite fast. Everything's basically starting inside of a transport or starting in reserves, which means you have a lot of board presence. You can get anywhere you want to be very quickly. You can also pop in from reserves on the sides of the board, on the flanks, and pick up really clean angles on vehicles or other targets. And I do think I want to mention this here because it is quite important. Now, the event was running UKTC terrain, and UKTC terrain is significantly different from what we're used to seeing with WTC or even with GW at that. So there are bigger firing lanes. I've never played on it, but this is kind of the consensus of what I've heard, is that there are generally bigger firing lanes. So maybe this also influenced the player's list design choice here to lean more heavily into some of these shooting pieces. And again, all that to say that the list is quite meta relevant. We've taken these considerations in mind in terms of what we might be expecting to face. A lot of people have been saying there's going to be a lot of vehicles, there's going to be a lot of 3-wound infantry, and this list is basically covering all of those threats. We have a response to any one of those meta threats that might be present at this event, and of course we're making use of that terrain format. Lastly, like I said a few times while we were discussing the list, I think it has excellent internal synergy. It's very clear that everything in this list is purposefully included and has a key role to play. Even down to the war gear loadouts that we're seeing with something like the Sagittars, where half of them are taking the L7, just to have a little bit more flexibility, to have a little bit more consistency, and the other ones are still running the high las. It does show that the player is anticipating having to synergize well with his list because he's bringing in so many variable damage. Like the Berserks, of course, are amazing in melee, but they're a little bit inconsistent and very swingy, which is quite similar to the Thunderkin as well, who have d6 number of shots. So if you roll really poorly, at least you have a backup plan. You're not just relying on one thing to get the job done. You have a lot of redundancies in the list to make sure that if you need something to happen at a critical moment, you have key pieces to help support that and guarantee it happens. Now, in terms of weaknesses, again, I say weaknesses, but this is just more overall questions that I have. It does have a little bit less staying power, this list. We don't have that many heavy-duty units that are going to just sit on an objective and survive. Yeah, sure, like the Berserks are a little bit annoying to shift, but they are just T5 infantry with only 2 wounds. They have a feel no pain, sure, but if something wanted to just auto-C and then potentially kill them, they could do it. So I do think that the list kind of lacks some good staying power. We do have 1 land fortress. We have a lot of vehicles as well, but assuming that other people are teching into anti-tank, then that means that these things are going to be a little bit less efficient at staying alive. So I do think that this is probably one of the questions I would have if I had to ask the pilot, is how he felt the staying power was, if he felt it was necessary at all, or if the name of the game here was just trading up and then eventually you just out-resource your opponent. My next question that I have, of course, is regarding the Thunderkin. I do feel like it's a little bit more vulnerable to move blocking, to screening, like just making sure that you can't actually reach your targets because your opponent is playing around them. So I wonder how much this impacted the player during his game. Probably not all that much since he got a really high score and really played super well at the event, but I would still be curious to hear how he felt they performed overall in terms of this potential liability with the unit, because they only have an 18-inch range gun, right? So like they come in from reserves. If your opponent screens out and makes sure that he's 18 inches away from wherever you can land, you're not shooting anything. So I do wonder overall how that felt. And again, on a similar note, Thunderkin and cover. Thunderkin are generally a little bit unreliable because they don't have any means of ignoring cover, which significantly dampens their output, right? So I guess with Grim Demeanor, this helps a little bit because you could ignore things like Armor Contempt, for example, or -1 damage, which is prevalent in the meta, of course. Think about like Custody tanks, like Telemons, for instance. So potentially this is mitigating that risk. But again, I would still just be curious to hear how he felt the unit performed overall, because it's something that we don't really see all that often, and usually for good reason. So yeah, overall, super interesting list. Really happy that it placed well. I think the pilot did a great job of designing this. There's a lot of internal synergy, like I said earlier, and I'm surprised that, well, I should say I'm happy to see that the lists that did do well weren't just running large 10-man Berserk squads, which I did feel like the meta was probably going to start demanding more of. It does look like we still have some flexibility, and Votann being Votann can easily adapt to the meta with our very limited roster of units, and still plays pretty well. So congratulations to the pilot here for a job well done. Alright, so before we talk about list 2, I just want to circle back here to look at some of these matchups and discuss. Now, I mentioned that this list, I think, is quite favorable into the Custodes matchup, namely because you're running 3 squads of 5 absolutely lethal infantry that are the bane of Custodes in a lot of ways. Obviously, Wardens are going to be able to pop their 4+++ once per game, but I think with the amount of firepower that you're bringing through the Thunderkins that have access to their D6 number of shots, the big 6-man brick, and of course with the Berserkers themselves, who are very efficient units inside of these targets, because they will be wounding them on 2s, pushing an invuln save, and every attack that just goes through will outright kill a model. So I think that the list is not necessarily designed to play into Custodes, but does very well into that army. And it's clear, of course, like I said, that we're running this list with the intent of playing against a lot of tanks and a lot of vehicles. It's just clear by the design of the direction the pilot took the list in. So I think that these 3 games against Custodes were significantly in the favor of the Votann player. And I think that's reflected in the scores as well, right? Like game 1 is 100 to Custodes at 29, 96 versus Custodes at 65, and then 96 versus Custodes at 58. So this is just like outright like a blowout, right? And I think a lot of these lists from what I had seen at BCP were that the Custodes players actually did have very good runs at the event as well, especially the last Custodian player. I think one of his only losses was against the Votann army. So this is kind of not necessarily curated, but this is a very favorable matchup for the Votann list because of how it's designed. The pilot probably anticipated running into a lot of these higher toughness infantry with 3 wounds and the vehicle meta, as we discussed earlier. And of course, we see the merit of that. We see the benefit of having that foresight and understanding what the metagame would look like. I mentioned I was surprised about the Votann versus Tau. I took a look at the Tau list, and it was a Kroot hunting pact detachment. So just a lot of infantry units, like mass squads, high OC, it has stealth. It's super annoying to deal with. Now, I think, again, this list is quite good into something like that because we have a good amount of our list invested in infantry that are melee oriented. So we're not necessarily fully dependent on having shooting that's going to pick up these large squads. We could just throw our melee infantry into them and pick up the units. Again, Hearthguard are obviously incredible into this. If you double judge a target or even just single judge it, you're going to be hitting it on 3s, going to 2s, potentially bouncing back to 3s because of stealth, but you're still hitting it on 3s. Massive quantity of shots as well through your grenade launcher and blast and the Vulcanites. Sustained hits 2 if you need to. And you're not that dependent on having to double judgment because these things are a lower toughness anyway, so you're going to be wounding them on 3s usually. I then look at the inclusion of the Thunderkin in this list, and I think that they fare quite well into the Tau army as well, because there are some vehicles, there are some suits that are being taken here. I think there were some fire knives that were included, and again, these Thunderkin will just pick those models up. Especially considering that for Tau, they do need to get a little bit closer with their suits, which means it's a little bit tougher for them to play around your short range. And again, the unit is also quite flexible because remember, it has access to blast. So if you're not putting your shots into the tanks, you can put them into the infantry instead. A massive amount of output because of course you have 6d6 plus blast on each one of these guns into 20-man infantry squads that have a single wound, that have a poor save. So when you do connect, and you're ignoring stealth because of grim demeanor, so when you do connect your damage to the targets, you do just wipe the entire unit. Of course, though, the benefit of the Tau here for the list is the mass number of OC that you have with the bodies. You get to move block. So potentially here, this is where we're seeing one of those drawbacks come into effect, where the Tau player can move block, can play around some of our slower movement speed and some of our shorter ranges, just to make sure to keep key targets out of our threat range. So I think it's very interesting to see how dynamic and flexible this list is when you consider that it's almost designed to play into tank meta and can still do extremely well into something that is horde infantry based because of that flexible access to blast on our tank guns. It's really good at trading for primary as well if you think about it, because inside of this matchup, you're going to be stacking, your opponent's going to be stacking OC on objectives with their mass infantry blobs. And when they do that, you just select that objective to have +1 judgment tokens with appraising glare. That inclusion, I think, is really key for this list to shine, because you can dictate where on the table all of your damage is going to have a higher chance of connecting to. So something does walk on, it's a big brick of infantry, one guy gets on it, you can see them with your full squad of Thunderkin, for example. You shoot into them, you have +1 to hit, you're effectively ignoring the stealth modifier, you're wounding them on 3s even if they aren't double judged, and you're just putting out a massive quantity of shots. So again, a really cool list, and I think that this matchup pairing here, seeing, I forgot to mention of course, but some of these custodians were running just like infantry-based armies, and then I think one of them was running the new detachment that had dreadnoughts. So looking at this matchup, looking at all these pairings together, I think it really shows and highlights how dynamic and flexible this list is at this event, at this meta, on this terrain setup. So a really solid list designed by Alex Jins here. So a big congratulations on coming 6th. Okay, so the second list I want to talk about was piloted by Greg Chamberlain. This one came 17th out of 396 players, taking home 4 wins, 0 draws, and only 1 loss. The scores were Votann at 100 versus Eldari at 37, Votann 84 versus Custodes at 66, Votann 87, the Thousand Suns at 86, a very close game, and then Votann at 100 versus Tyranids at 37, and to wrap the event off, the only loss of 85 to GSC at 90. So even when we did lose here, the score was very tight and very close. I was really excited to see this list as well, because this too I found was pretty unique. It feels like a really big throwback to the earlier days of the edition, and excited to talk about this one in just a moment. Alright, so putting the list up on the screen for you here, yeah, this one's pretty cool. So we're running an E-Champ for characters. We have a Cowl with Grim Demeanor, another Cowl with Appraising Glare, a squad of 10 Hearthkin Warriors, a Sagittar, 6 Thunderkin again making an appearance here, but this time they're unaccompanied. We have a single 5-man Berserk squad, 2 squads of 10 Ironeer Hearthguard, 1 squad of 5 Ironeer Hearthguard, everything equipped with the same loadout of the Concussion Gauntlets, Hammer, and the Vulcanites. We then have a Hecaton Land Fortress and 3 squads of 3 Pioneers. Interestingly, no Jaegers, but this makes perfect sense. We really are not trying to make use of scout moves early in the game, and we have so few resources here, just being really elite heavy. I think the pilot had named this list like everybody is running stat check armies, so I'm going to run one too. It was something like that, which I think is very funny, because when you think of Votann, you don't really think about a stat check army. But this list is really fun. I think this is reminiscent of the earlier edition days where people were running like 30 Hearthguard. It's pretty cool, because it's fallen out of flavor and you don't really ever see this. So let's talk about this one a little bit. All right, so a couple things I want to talk about it for this list here, because I think it's actually quite cool. We have an E-Champ. He's running the Mass Hammer. He's going to be attached to the 5-man Hearthguard brick. Nothing crazy here, riding inside of a Land Fortress. This is your very easy delete button. It could get somewhere really quickly because the Land Fortress can move, then you disembark, and you have the 18-inch range on your guns, meaning that you have a pretty high threat range. Then with the Cowls, we see that things are a little bit more interesting. So we are running Grim Demeanor for 1 set of 10. I suppose when you're running something that's over 360 points, you might as well just include Grim Demeanor here to guarantee, again, that your output all connects. More relevant, of course, for something like in melee, but it does help you ignore any modifiers that would affect like your chance to hit or wound or something like that. You do have a lower strength weapon, and your hit's only going to be on 3s, going to 2s if they're judged. So you don't really want to lose that. You don't want to have something pushing you to hit on 4s with this big brick. So having Grim Demeanor here again just increases that efficiency overall. The Cal's also interesting because he provides lethal hits. I do believe when we covered this in the math video on the Hearthguard loadout that the Cal is probably the better choice only if you're running a 10-man Hearthguard brick. So with a 10-man brick, it's worth bringing a Cal because you are going to have only those strength 5 shots on the Vulcanites, and you just help get a few more that go through on your hit rolls, automatically negating the wound chance. So you just guarantee that your opponent takes a few more saves. It lets you punch up a little bit better as well into things like higher toughness targets like elite infantry or vehicles. We then have a second Cal, like I mentioned earlier, with Appraising Glare. So again, another essential here. And Appraising Glare is really nice in this detachment because with the Cals, I'm not a big fan of the Cal's ability. It's no surprise because it only takes effect inside of the command phase and you can only use it with a single Cal for some reason. But in this design specifically, where you're running a 10-man Hearthguard brick, he is very likely to still be alive at the start of your next turn. Like after this unit comes down, it activates, it does its thing, your opponent has their turn to respond. The chances of your full 10-man Hearthguard brick disappearing, including the Cal, are probably quite low. And if they do put out enough resources to pick up the full Hearthguard brick, then you get to choose whatever you want to kill in return. So it's a win-win. And I do think in this specific design, it's actually quite nice because the Cal then gets to put his token on something, and then you could combo that with Appraising Glare. So either you could split tokens up across the board, be in 2 places at once, or you could double up if something's on an objective marker, and now boom, suddenly it's sitting on 2 judgment tokens. In terms of loadouts here, this Cal's taking a Plasma Axe, the other one is just taking a Mass Gauntlet. I suppose it helps a little bit for different matchups. Maybe you need to use one on turn 2 to rapid ingress and deal with something that, I don't know, like Marine Bodies, for example, whereas the second one wants to come down on turn 3 instead and deal with something a little bit more elite. Now, the other thing that's interesting to me here is that we're only running a single Sagittar. This means that if we want to split our Hearthkin Warriors up at the start of the game, which we're obviously going to be doing, that our Berserk squad is going to start on foot. Not necessarily the end of the world. A little bit risky, I think, in a meta where indirect might be becoming a little bit more prevalent, especially on Marines. But I do see that, there is some potential benefit to having them anyway in this list, even if they are on the board. The list is very elite heavy. And because of that, we're really low on early game trading pieces. We have to commit our big Hearthguard bricks. And I think because of that, the Berserks give you a little bit extra. It gives you some punch where you might not necessarily want to commit your 5-man Hearthguard brick to, or even your 10-man brick, right? Like the 5-man is going to do enough presence usually that you can negate having to invest some of your other units there for at least a turn. Now, another thing that's interesting is that we're only running the 6-man Thunderkin alone without a character attached to them. I don't really know how I feel about Thunderkin in general. I'm not a big fan. I think maybe on UKTC it works a little bit better because it looks, from what I saw anyway on the images, coming in from reserves, you do have access to a lot of angles. But I still think it's a bit risky. You're investing the points in a 6-man brick. It doesn't really have any protection to being overwatched, whereas the Ecogs that come with the Iron Master are able to basically absorb a full overwatch turn from your opponent on most units. It also means you might be a little bit more susceptible to modifiers that affect your damage output, for example, because you don't have Grim Demeanor. And this is personal experience, but when I have tried running 6-man Thunderkins that did not have an Iron Master, the unit just flopped. So I'm not 100% sure about this choice included here. It is a good vehicle tech piece. Into Marines, I don't know too much because they do get access to cover sometimes, almost always. And they will also have access to armor contempt. Maybe again on UKTC, it's harder to get cover. I'm not entirely sure. I've heard that the firing lanes are a lot less forgiving. So maybe that is one of the factors that is leading to us seeing a little bit more of a Thunderkin presence inside of these Votann lists. Again, not 100% sure. If you guys know or have some thoughts about that, please share it with me in the comments below. And the last thing I'll add is that it is nice to see 3 squads of Pioneers here. We don't have any Jaegers, but again, we don't really need them. We aren't making use of scout moves all that much. There isn't really any major staging that's going to be happening here with this list outside of our rapid ingress 10-man Hearthguard bricks. So again, not super reliant on our opponent not getting in our face turn one, and or also just like denying our scout moves on our single Sagittar. It's not really the end of the world. These bikes here, I think inside of this list are going to be more of a late game piece. You might be using two of them to do some kind of action secondaries on the flanks, maybe like containment or something like that. I could see these being more of a secondary throwaway piece because we don't really have all that many activations because we're so elite heavy. But again, it really does help to just have these really quick moving units that can go up and down if needed to score you something like behind enemy lines, engage on all fronts, containment, for example. They're quite flexible in that regard, and I think they work really nicely in this list, a little bit better than having the Jaegers. I know a lot of people have said they miss seeing Hearthguard, so now you have a list here with 25 that you could try emulating yourself. Alright guys, thank you so much for tuning into this week's video. It was really nice to see not just one, but two Votann lists perform extremely well at such a major event. I think a lot of people, myself included, were a little afraid of Votann not having a place in this brave new meta, but it looks like at the very least we still have some teeth in the UK. Stay tuned for next week as we debut the Team League mini-series, my first teams experience ever, and something I am super excited to start playing at this week and sharing the progress and sharing the experience with you guys here on YouTube. Again, a big thank you to our channel members and of course our Discord community, which you could join free of charge by following the link down in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next one.